Chico's river shrimp is an excellent saltwater pattern I use regularly around the shallow water flats and oyster bars of Central Florida. The fly rides hook point up, and the deer hair collar acts as a weed guard. It lands lightly yet pushes some water. The original pattern, as designed by Chico Fernandez, was tied with lead wrapped around the hook shank. I prefer to add weight with a bead, which is quicker than using lead wire, and gives the fly a slightly different look in action. I also trim the deer hair a little differently. This was initially tied as a snapping shrimp pattern, but the fish don't know that, and the fly works just fine when fish are feeding on baitfish. Tied in different colors and sizes, I've used the Chico's river shrimp to catch redfish, black drum, small tarpon, snook, flounder, and even a sheep's head. A recipe for the fly can be found in the video description. Start by sliding a bead onto the hook, with a small opening towards the eye of the hook. Put the hook in your vise, and start the thread. I usually start close to the bead and lay down a thread base as I work towards the bend, but you can save a little thread and start it closer to the bend. Trim the tag end and advance the thread to just around the bend. Pinch a little away from the end of the chenille and pull off some of the fibers to expose the core. Then tie the chenille in, wrapping the exposed core down against the hook shank. This will avoid creating a lump at the tie-in point. Advance the thread up to 1/3 of the hook shank behind the eye. Tie a half hitch, then wrap the chenille forward, covering the hook shank evenly. Roll some thread back on the bobbin to shorten it up, and, while keeping tension on the chenille, use your materials hand to pass the bobbin behind the chenille rope and over the top a couple times, trapping the chenille underneath. Then you can bring the thread in front and add a couple locking wraps. Trim the excess chenille and wrap down the tag end. This is a good place to tie a half hitch. If it's not already, position the hook so it's point up. The point side will be the top of the finished fly. Cut a clump of craft fur and clean it, pulling out the short underfur. It starts out pretty thick, but as I remove underfur, it thins out quickly. Even up the tips a little if needed. Tie the craft fur in on the point side of the hook with 2 hook lengths extending past the tie-in point. I'm going to measure, then trim the butt ends before tying it in. Secure the craft fur in place directly on top of the hook shank, on the point side of the hook, right in front of the chenille. Hold it firmly as you tie it in to keep it from rolling around the hook. Get 3 or 4 strands of Flashabou. Find the midpoint and wrap them around the thread. Then guide them into place on top of the hook shank in front of the craft fur. Wrap back to the craft fur, laying the Flashabou down the center of the craft fur. Trim the Flashabou as long as, or slightly longer than, the craft fur. Cut a clump of deer hair off the hide. When compressed, it should be about half as thick as a standard pencil. This is deer body hair, which has the right amount of buoyancy and flare for this fly. I also like the dark tips, which gives it some contrast. I'm going to clean out the underfur, but I don't care if the tips are even, so I'm not going to worry about evening them up. The deer hair should be tied in with the tips facing back. I want the tips to extend the length of a hook gap past the back of the hook. I'm going to cut the butt ends so they'll be shorter than the tips once they're tied in, extending around a hook shank length in front of the tie-in point. The butt ends will form a collar, and cutting them now makes the final trimming a lot easier. Hold the deer hair on top of the hook shank, extending back over the craft fur. Place 2 loose wraps around the hair. Then pull down to tighten the thread, while holding the deer hair firmly in place on top of the hook. If you have trouble keeping the hair in place, try rotating it up to a quarter turn towards you before tightening. Pinch tightly with your materials hand as the material flares to keep it from rotating. Bring the thread around and through the hair at the tie-in point several more times, making sure to pull the thread tight after each wrap. Some of the hair may spread out around the hook, but the majority should still be on top. I like to post the wing and collar, made up of the craft fur, Flashabou, and deer hair, to keep the material together and force it to stand up. Pick the material up together and drop the bobbin over behind. Then bring the thread around in front and over the top, placing a full wrap around the base. Put 3 or 4 more wraps around the base of the material. When you're done, the wing and collar should be bundled together and sticking up towards the point of the hook. Bring the thread in front and finish with some locking wraps. Then tie a half hitch. You should have a small gap between the materials you just posted and the bead. Cut another clump of deer hair 1.5 to 2 times thicker than the first bunch and clean out the underfur. I'm going to trim the butt ends flush, then turn the deer hair around and cut off the tips. This is to make sure this bunch doesn't mix with the tips extending back from the first batch, which would make trimming more difficult. Lay the deer hair on top of the hook, parallel with the shank, with the middle of the clump right over the point where the thread is hanging down. Make a loose wrap around the middle of the clump while holding it firmly in place. Then increase tension with the second wrap and let the deer hair slip out of your fingers and spin around the hook. Continue with more wraps, which need to be tight enough to secure the hair and cause it to flare. Here it is again slow. The first wrap is very loose. As I follow with tight wraps and let go of the deer hair, you can see the thread chasing the deer hair around the hook. You need really tight wraps here, both so the material will stay in place and so it will flare. If you do it right, you'll end up with a ball of deer hair. Check to make sure the hair is evenly distributed. If you have a bare spot, just cut another small clump of deer hair and pack it into the gap. Put several additional tight wraps through the middle, right over the tie-in point. Then bring the thread through the flared hair to the front. Use the finger triangle to pull the deer hair back, exposing the bead. And add some locking wraps up against the bead. If you used enough deer hair, your thread will be right behind the bead. If there's a gap, you can spin another small clump of hair around the hook to fill the space. Whip finish while holding the hair back out of the way. The deer hair is a little difficult to control. Don't worry about it if you catch a few loose hairs in the whip finish. I like to whip finish twice just to be sure. Then trim the thread. Add some head cement to secure your whip finish. I use a relatively thin, penetrating head cement for this fly. I want to make sure it soaks into the thread wraps, which may be buried pretty deeply between the bead and the deer hair. Now it's time to trim the deer hair. I usually start with the bottom, trimming the hair tight to form a rounded belly, leaving enough length that it extends a little way past where the chenille starts. I want the body to curve out on the way up to a much larger top. Next, I'll trim the front of the body, resting my scissors on the bead. I'm trimming a half circle with just the scissor tips that tapers up from front to back. With the deer hair tips folded back, you can see the collar formed by the cut ends. I would clean it up if needed, but the ends are even and the length is good, so I'm going to leave it just like it is. The remaining trimming will fine-tune the shape. It takes me several minutes to trim each fly. I'd rather go slow and get it right than take off too much material and ruin the fly. A little bit of barring on the craft fur can dress the fly up nicely. A chisel point permanent marker makes this easy. I use a piece of paper underneath the fly and use the marks on the paper from the first fly I add bars to as a pattern for the rest. The Beadhead Chico's river shrimp is quick to tie once you get the hang of it. It is a versatile fly that is easy to cast and can be fished in many different ways. It's one of my favorite patterns for tailing redfish on grass flats. It lands lightly, is relatively snag-free, and can be fished as slow or fast as the fish and conditions demand. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.